Hi, today we're at Warehouse Liquors, the tasting room, and we're going to do an interview with my good friend Beau Beckman and my other great friend Susannah Hubler. And Beau and Susannah work for Buffalo Trace in their barrel program. We are hoping to have some fun and exploit information that might be interesting and informative. So I guess the question that we'll start with is, how long have you been with Buffalo Trace?
I've been there, it'll be 4 years in October. Yeah. So I started 2 different roles. I started on the quality side, working in the lab, and then switched to the barrel program about 2 years ago, year and a half.
How about yourself?
June 27th, 2011 was when I started.
I remember too.
I've yet to see a barrel of Buffalo Trace get filled and dumped. It's kind of how I gauge it. It's how long I've been there.
It's been close.
Well, these are coming as your son will eventually oversee this program as well.
June will hit.
Yeah.
How did you guys start working for Buffalo Trace?
Mine was kind of random. I went to school for chemistry, so kind of towards the end of my time there, this is kind of the area I wanted to get into, and then it was just kind of meeting the right people that opened up that pathway.
How did peanut butter fit into that?
That's where I started first, testing peanut butter for different types of things, and then transitioned to doing bourbon.
Oh, nice segue. How about you?
I hijacked her out of the Buffalo Trace lab.
Aha.
We had a barrel selection, and I couldn't be there, and I needed someone to cover it, and she volunteered. It never happened.
What was your first mistake?
Yeah.
And haven't looked back.
So you got a connection to a famous character from Buffalo Trace history, and that would be Colonel E.H. Taylor. Could you tell me about him?
Yeah, so that was how I got my foot in the door, how my resume, I think, got looked at. It was a convenient convergence of circumstances. So I graduated in 2008, which was a bad time to graduate college. So that was that nice little depression there. And I started working with a buddy of mine doing internet marketing. So it was all a bunch of driving traffic to websites that he built. And then it turned in from driving traffic to building a CRM, a customer relationship management tool that manages sales. So it lets the GMs kind of track sales, lets the salesmen follow up on leads. So I was building these systems. Well, simultaneously, that was about the time we reacquired the old Taylor brand. And my grandmother, who is married to so this is my step-grandmother, it gets a little convoluted when you go into this, is married to my grandfather, E.H. Taylor Hay Jr. And she was working on a documentary at the time for the distillery called the Oral History Project. So she was interviewing Elmer, interviewing Freddie. Freddie's dad was still alive at the time. Interviewing Mark Brown, interviewing Julian. And around that time, we reacquired the old Taylor brand. And my grandparents' house in Frankfort was about 3 miles from, not even 3 miles from the distillery. My grandfather got an old bottle of E.H. Taylor from 100 years ago and gave it to Mark. And he was like, oh, perfect, we'll use that package. So Joanna's my grandmother, step-grandmother, was working with the distillery, and then she said, you know, she was working with the marketing department on that video, and they said they had this barrel program, but they needed someone to run it and build a system to manage the sales. So I submitted my resume, and I put Taylor in my middle name, Beau Taylor Beckman. So I'm sure that kind of helped get it looked at, but it just conveniently, they didn't see needed someone to manage the sales, build a system, and that's what my background was. So lined up perfectly.
Huh. How did that lead into a barrel program?
Well, so at the time, this is getting a little minutia, but if you wanted to buy a barrel, you would basically be sending an email to John. John's behind the camera, no one can see him. John would then send an email to Sarah Tenhorse. Sarah would then send an email to me. And by that time, that game of telephone, things would get lost. So we built a web-based system where people can just input all the stuff right on that system and track their barrel orders. So that went from just like a little Excel and Outlook program to a web-based system, singlebarrelselect.com. So it's kind of frustrating because I was hired to grow our barrel program, and I built a system so where any consumer go in, log on, place a barrel order. As soon as I was done building it is when allocation started. So now I had a place for people to buy barrels, but no barrels to sell. So it was a lot of
pretty much the story of your life.
It is. That's right. Yeah. I
very
much missed 2011 through 2014. It was like the wild, wild west of barrels. That's when, buy an Elmer, buy a Weller,
Oh yeah,
Blame.
no. Well, in its own format, there was encouragement to that. I've got lists of things from Weller 12 as a single barrel program. So
I hear people say that. I don't have any data. My data goes back to 2004 of a Weller 12 barrel ever being sold. Unless they packaged
Was it Weller? That was
I've
just
seen
maybe
Weller
12 years.
Centennial,
Yeah.
which was a 10-year-old.
I'll show you something when we get back.
I'm guessing you probably pre-existed the first website. So Mark Brown built our first Microsoft Access system. This is basically, barrel program is his baby. And so that's where my data only goes back to 2004. So if you did it before then I'm going to see it.
Well, I have info. We'll leave it to that. Let's see. So I guess, what is the favorite part of this job that you have now?
Mine is interacting with people coming in, consumers and retailers. That's something I didn't get when I was in the lab that I enjoyed by working tastings and things like that. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to do long term, it was definitely interacting with customers. That's what I enjoy the most.
Yeah, you meet a lot of great people. That's a lot of fun.
Biased.
I personally, I like the building something and watching it grow has been a lot of fun. Just taking this small barrel program at Buffalo Trace, and then we've added distilleries in Mexico, Canada, more in Kentucky, Scotland.
It's exciting as you've expanded on some levels, you've been forced to retract on others because the allocations are limited because it takes time to be able to make whiskey, but you're consistently reinventing yourself, and we're on the cusp of a great deal of excitement. When I was in Kentucky a couple of years ago, you put me in your pickup truck and we drove around looking at new warehouses sprouting up like stalks from a cornfield. There's a lot of capacity in this process, and there's so much more to be done.
Yeah. Challenge is you can make a lot more fans of Buffalo Trace than you do every day than we can put barrels away. You made 10 new fans today. Well, if we put 10 barrels away today, then that's 8 years we have to wait when the fans are fans today.
It's a great problem.
Yeah.
So let's see. What do you think, because you both have science backgrounds, how does science influence your art?
I don't have a science background, I should say that. I'm a marketing background.
Well, I think
but I do love, I'm a computer nerd.
That counts. It does a lot. We were kind of just talking about this earlier, because still the majority of it is going to be in art. There's definitely things they look at, but even when I started there in the lab, I'd come from a very technical lab before that, and all my schooling, everything was very technical. When I switched working at the distillery, it was 70% is what you were going to taste, look at, smell, and that was a whole new world to me. So they'll still go back and do analytical testing on things, mainly so over the time you have something to compare. Is it changing on a chemical level? But I would say the majority of it is really down to an art, especially with the tasting and when the final packaging and all of that is more going to be leaning towards art at that point, which keeps it cool and interesting and new and all that.
It's more, we use science more to verify than less to start or prove something. So we're not, a good example is Warehouse X we built because we want to learn about what's actually happening when barrels age. And I remember getting an email from the University of Louisville Engineering School that wanted to do a project on Warehouse X because they said, well, we heard you're trying to speed up the aging process. Like, no, that's not at all what we're trying to do. We're just trying to understand more about it. Because if you just think of when someone says, oh, the best spot in this warehouse is top floor, the rick next to the window. All right, well, if a barrel of Eagle Rare sat there for 10 years, that's one data point over 10 years. So then a barrel before that, if that was 10 years, that's 2 data points over 20 years. So how much can one person really learn? So you have to have some sort of science to back that up.
Plus the fact that wood, each one is a distinct individual, and the same process with different wood is hugely different. Your experimental program basically proved the viva la difference. They're snowflakes. There's no direct way to be able to do that. You've got propensities of likelihood, but that kind of leads me into my next questions. The first part leading, do either of you have a favorite warehouse?
Yes, but that's just because E.H. Taylor built it. So I like Warehouse C. I think it's the coolest.
So it's not relative to flavor, it's more romantic?
No. In my world, no, because Sue can have her own opinion here, but when we are tasting single barrels, that's all we do really is we're tasting single barrels every day. And if we can say, all right, none of this is proven, but say 60% of the flavor is the barrel, then you have your yeast, your distillation proofs, your entry proofs, your age, the proof you dump it at, how you chill filter it. If that makes up the other 40% recipe, how much of that really is going to impact when the barrel is 60% of it. So, if the warehouse is, say, 5% of it, you can't ignore everything else when it's single barrel. The way you can look at a warehouse is if you keep everything the same and then do a big batch, and that's not what we're tasting. So it's hard to say, like, one warehouse is better than the other.
So my interpretation within that realm is understandable, but people do have, different environments that you feel ideally to keep these together. So the question that bears in this is you take rye mash bill 1, or 2 for that matter, and you've got something that's either going to be Buffalo Trace or Eagle Rare, but they're born in the barrel the same way. Do you choose which warehouse that's going to become a Buffalo Trace warehouse, or is there a floor that's a Buffalo Trace floor?
Yeah.
How are these determined? Are they done in advance?
Yeah, so it's pretty much have been mapped out, dating back years of where brands kind of age and mature well. But even though when we're filling a barrel, kind of predicting it to end up aging a certain way, we'll go put it there in a certain floor, a certain warehouse, X amount of time. It never gets branded until it gets taste tested. So that's the final kind of straw there. So when they taste it against a standard that's been approved, even though where they aged and everything could have been an Eagle Rare area, but they don't think it matches Eagle Rare, then they're not going to force it to be Eagle Rare. So it really comes down to tasting it at the end. The tasting panel sits around, looks at it, and say, "Yep, this aged the way we expected it to," or "No, it didn't." And if it didn't, then they can kind of maneuver it if need be.
I'll explain that a lot by saying, I wear this analogy out, but I like it, so I keep going back to it. Say Pappy 23 is Harvard. So we have barrels that we're making today that we are going to groom to go to Harvard. So we're going to send them to the best schools, so put them in certain parts of the warehouse where we know they age well. But ultimately, when they turn 23, they have to get admitted to Harvard. And if they don't, then they're not going to get in. They're going to have to go to a different school. At the same time, there are barrels that we're putting in, say, the top floor of warehouse D. Those are going to be going to junior college. They're going to be ancient age. At 3 years old, 4 years old, whatever the age is, they're going to get dumped out, batched together in a large batch. There were plenty of kids that went to that junior college that had we let them age up, they could have been significantly, just fantastic. But they never really had a chance. So it's, just because you put a barrel away and you have a plan for it doesn't mean that plan is going to come to fruition. Yeah.
So you must come across surprises, serendipitous as well as punishing. Have there been particularly fun surprises that have inspired maybe even additional projects in that, because there's flavors that you didn't necessarily expect to develop from the aging process?
Yeah, I think the Tornado, the E.H. Taylor Tornado series, or well, it's not really a series, it was a one-time release, was a good example of that. So we had a tornado, I think it was 2005. It was one of the storms that spun off of Katrina, and it took the top of the warehouse off warehouse C. So the barrels sat there exposed for 6 months. And so when we tasted them and bottled them, they were delicious. And that alone was what drove us to building Warehouse X. Because, Mark Brown's thinking, well, for all we know, we could put a barrel in the field. And so we wanted to test all these different conditions of aging.
With Mark, it'd probably be which fields are you going to work with, too.
Yeah.
the what if goes exponential in no time.
That is an interesting part of the experimental program, is the accelerating returns. The more things you do, the more branches can come off of it. So it's an endless world of things.
Are there more positive responses to this, or are there huge groups of things that had failed and never really see the light of day? Is it half and half?
There are...
The half and half.
Yeah, it's hard to say half and half. I don't think it's half and half, but there are definitely failed experiments.
Yeah.
I remember there was a conversation when I started where we had a failed experiment, and we thought about releasing this experiment, and writing "failed" really big across the package and selling it for pretty cheap. But we were still worried people were going to buy it, taste it, and say, "Well, that's not very good." Well, yeah, because it didn't work.
They see failed. Yeah. No. And of course, reading isn't an important part of drinking.
Yeah, it's really more of it is for us.
Yeah, like learning.
To learn.
Mm-hmm.
4 grain is another one.
Yeah, even if it's a failed thing, you still learned. Okay, maybe we don't want to go that route, or maybe branches that we were going to try off of that, but it's completely off of, we'll just not waste our time with. But
so you take
still learning experience.
Yeah, no, well, always, that's half the fun. Mm-hmm. You take the 4 grain, which has been greatly successful, but you've done 6 grain at different points, and you haven't really released those outside of the experimentals. Any particular reason?
I don't have specifically the 6 grain why or why not. Generally, when we do those experiments, we'll taste them after, we'll taste them along the way, but you don't really have a good idea of how they're developing until around like 3, maybe 2 or 3 years old. So at that point, you can go back and put more barrels away. So likely with the 6 grain, if we just didn't feel we loved it, then we're just not going to put more barrels away again. So it'll be a one-time release. So like 4 grain, we loved it. So then we went back and we're going to do more of it.
Yeah.
But there's a gap between the first time we did it and the second time. So that's why it's an everyday release.
I maintain everything starts off as a good idea, but
Yeah.
watch how these things develop.
But that is, the experimental program is as much of what not to do as much of teaching us things to do.
Fair warning, but the nature of that is quite ambitious, and considering that you're working with 4 recipes, the possibilities that you've been able to garner from that have been extremely rewarding, and variations of nuance to that are always in a world of what if, which directly addresses that. Even working with the basics that you normally are, different age statements, different alcohol concentrations, all these things figure into it. So brings us to a new project that I'm extremely excited about, and I understand there's a press release today about the Weller Foolproof, the blue label. What can you guys tell me about that?
I think a lot of that one, at least from my experience with customers, everybody coming in to pick single barrels, their first question is, can we get this foolproof? Now with the Weller especially, can we get this non-chill filtered? So that one to me was just kind of a drive by the consumer, something that they were pushing for, they wanted, that we were like, all right, we hear you, let's do it. So I think it'll be a huge hit, obviously, because I get requests for it every time I have people in. I'm excited for once to be like, yes, you can do this at foolproof. But yeah, very exciting release.
Yeah, a lot of the things, we want to do things like the Blanton straight from the barrel. You hear, why can't we do that in the United States? Why can't we do that here? Well, we're so far from having enough Blantons that if we were to do something like that, it's going to divide our current Blantons in half and make less of it, because when you add water, you get more. So it's going to make it even harder to get, which make people think we're just driving the scarcity on purpose, and you're just not.
So my question that addresses that is, you do have Blantons. What about the possibility of distinguishing with, say, a non-chill filter program, since it's a 94 anyway, to be able to augment that, maybe just in the single barrel program, but you still are using the same amount that you have, but giving it an added richness and dimension that a filtration takes out. There's advantages to filtration, but it's largely protecting somewhat diluted spirits, and as something at 94, it would hold a lot of flavor.
I think we're getting closer. You see this with Weller Foolproof, but we're still on the train of it's got to be above 100 proof at least to consider it because of the flocking. And it's crazy to our world. I would imagine anybody watching this is a big bourbon guy or gal. So are you, so are we. But the vast majority of people don't know what non-chill filtered is, and what they see is floaters and fatty acids in their whiskey and think that there's some gross thing floating around in their booze. And we get complaints, so it's hard to do it for the masses right away.
6 years ago, you indulged me and let me do that on a Weller program, and you were concerned about it, but we did it for quite a few years before it became more public. I've described those as flavor crystals, and all of my customers prefer these in that. So it might be a newer part to this process, but a wildly enthusiastic groupings to that. And my consistent request is always to have more whiskey in your whiskey, and taking some of that out through a filtration does alter its natural ambience. And just a thought, that is to be considered, working with the same quantities of juice that you have, but typically in the Scotch world, anything above 92 is usually safe from flacking. So that's something that is more distinct to you with at 50% than the rest of the whiskey world.
Yeah, I think it's something too that they're just kind of really starting to explore different filtrations, how we can do things. Just for the longest time, everything was just chill filtered because flocking. But now it's like, okay, since we start doing a little bit that way and we don't see it, it's kind of like, how can we change it? Can it be lower proof than 100? Is it the 100 proof? Is it the amount of water that's added? Does that go back to the recipe that will make it flock or not? So I think it's just something that they have to look into a little bit more to figure out kind of where the line is.
Bourbon drinkers are becoming more educated, and as they become more educated, we could do things like that. When I started, I knew someone knew a little bit about bourbon if they knew Jack Daniels wasn't bourbon.
Yeah.
And now the growth from that to what people know now is just, exponential.
it's hugely satisfying to see the real interest in this process and be able to augment that. But if any company challenges standard convention of rules, you guys do, and that's sort of the nature of this process.
It helps to be privately owned with us.
Yeah.
Because as barrels age, you're losing inventory as the cost of that inventory is going up. So that's a hard thing to justify if you're a publicly owned company, to say, hey, we're going to let our inventory go down while the cost of it goes up. Hope everyone's cool with that.
There's an exceptional level of integrity that Buffalo Trace has always stood by, and that's keeping pricing at a fair price despite where the market is. I'd rather not sell whiskey than increase the price or dilute it to be able to sate the current demand. And it's something worth noting that very few companies have that level of integrity and continue to bring that forward along with some of the best flavors that are available in the whiskey world. So my consistent thinking along these lines is, well, obviously we'd like more whiskey in our whiskey. I certainly would. This addresses the wheat program. We'd like to be able to do something in a rye mash bill 1 and possibly 2, even though it might not necessarily be a Blanton's barrel. There's a range of different things as well. But let's do rye mash bill 1. My ideal balance of Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare, Stag. What's the likelihood of getting a cask strength in rye mash bill 1, i.e. Stag Junior?
So good, just when? You know, is it 2 years, 3 years? That's, you know, I just don't know with those things. So much of it is, you know, we used to do barrels of Elmer. But once you get to a point where we have more good customers, loyal customers, than we do barrels, it doesn't make sense to sell it by the barrel. So as production increases and we have enough barrels of Stag to do that with, then we'll, and Stag Junior to do that with, then we would, you know, definitely consider it.
Good save.
It's on my target list for sure, though. We don't have a barrel proof offering in our barrel program. We have full proof. We don't actually have a barrel proof.
That was the nice part with the Stag Junior. You've already got an established label. That's fine. All you have to do is slap on a medallion. You're good to go, except for the computer part.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I wish it was that easy.
But that type of thing too, I think, just with the barrel program and other things, everyone's figuring out how to handle the barrel proof things. So that's why we were kind of re-talking about it, because now these systems are even set up on the computer to make that process hopefully a little bit easier, so that we can do some of that.
There's a world of logistics that goes on that it's just any company's barrel program is a one-off to every process they do at that distillery. So it doesn't fit in any sort of good pipeline. So it's just, you have to be cognizant of offering something that you can't produce feasibly. You know, there's a lot of cool things I'd love to do, but if I tried to throw that at our distilleries, they would kill me.
I love my toys, and as we both, and all three of us know, my interests are insatiable. But you've got 4 mash bills, and I've always deemed to try to get more whiskey in my whiskey. Rye mash bill 2, something that is incredibly in demand, anything from Elmer to Blanton's to Rock Hill Farm, even the Bowman products in Virginia are that. In that I understand that the Bowman products are becoming more available, but that still has to be fairly limited in its scope. There's John J. Bowman is a single barrel program. I've fantasized about the idea of it. I used to be able to buy Elmer T. Lee barrels, and so I'd fantasize about finding some way to attach Rye Mash Bill 2 as a single barrel program, as well as a cask strength, which is separate in its own realm. How close are the barrel programs on Rye Mash Bill 2 to fruition?
So what was the final question there?
I'd like to be able to do. I have a Blanton's barrel on occasion, so I'll grant that. I guess the question varied in that I would like to see something in cask strength in Rye Mash Bill 2. And I'd also like to see an augmentation to Blanton's as a single barrel program, i.e. John J. Bowman, or bringing back Elmer T. Lee once there's sufficient stocks. How likely is a John J. Bowman program potentially, and when will Elmer T. Lee be available in larger numbers?
Yeah, so 2 separate things. Bowman is in Virginia and it's a craft distillery. That'll be back in the program before too long. So if you've been on singlebarrelselect.com, it has A. Smith Bowman as one of our distilleries, but I haven't had barrels to sell there since 2014. Eventually that'll be back, but it's just such a small scale that we're producing that it's hard to go out of Virginia at this point.
Right.
But I know we've been talking about it for we've talked about all these for once a year for however many years.
At least.
Yeah. And then the rye mash bill too goes back to what we were saying earlier, where right now we're so far apart from, we don't have anywhere close enough Blanton's, don't have anywhere close enough Elmer. And if you think about the Buffalo Trace Distillery's capacity, we have to make more Buffalo Trace, have to make more Weller, more Taylor, more Eagle Rare, more Blanton's, more Elmore. You have to make all of those at the same time. And we can't just quadruple the capacity of the warehouses overnight. So we're building a new warehouse every 3 months. But once you build enough more warehouses, then you have to build more stills and more fermentation tanks. So we're doing all that, but you just can't grow all the brands at the pace we want to. And if you could, then we'd be able to do more things like straight from the barrel on mash too. But right now we're just so far apart of what we need to produce for what people want that taking away from that doesn't make sense.
When will the next stills be in action?
So they're doing more warehouses now, which you got to go up and see. So the goal there is 30 more warehouses over the next 10 years, I think is the goal. Starting this summer, we're already expanding kind of down in the distillery is what they're doing. So replacing all the cookers, pretty much doubling the sizes of those, then adding more fermenters, and then there'll be talk of kind of the new still. So it's coming up. I mean, a lot of the expansion has already been going on with the warehouses, but definitely starting this summer in the production side of things.
We're making a lot of big bets on bourbon right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that being said though, you're really looking ahead. To be able to do that now means that you're very much hoping that the boom will continue before the next bust follows, which goes in cycles and always has. But in the short of it, even with these new plans in there, you're looking at least 6 to 8 years before these things, generate real capacity of delivery to the public. So we'll make a transition into an exciting new program, the Corazon Boomerang program, something which I was fortunate to be able to take part of early on. Talk about it.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a no-brainer in my world where you have everybody picking barrels of bourbon, and you have done a great job of developing a base of consumers that are now looking for barrel picks. They understand that every barrel's different, that bourbon ages in a barrel. There's a lot of people who don't grasp a lot of these little things, how long things age. They just think, oh, it's 10 years old, but what do you mean you can't make more overnight? And so with the single barrel program, you're already using barrels, using used bourbon barrels for scotch and tequila and rum and beer. So it just made sense to say, hey, there's 5 barrels in front of you and you're at the distillery tasting right out of the barrel. And we all deem number 5 as the best. It's the best barrel there. And earlier I talked about how much impact the barrel itself has. So it's just a shame in my book to put that barrel in retirement. Say, all right, that barrel's done. You were great, we're never going to use you again. So it just made sense to think, well, we got a tequila distillery. Why don't we put tequila in this, use it again? And then as that develops, we've talked about rum. We want to add rum to the barrel program. Cognac, we can't put cognac in used bourbon barrels, but
you could invert that too. I mean, I'm very excited about the rum program. Rum is a great new extension of the bourbon drinkers who decided that they used to interpret rum as a spiced event that is something that you would dump soda into, but now rum has become a drink to itself. And with the quality of wood that Buffalo Trace brings to that, and with a new rum company in its development with you guys, this program could develop fairly quickly. Not as quickly as tequila, the nature of the environment, but very exciting, to be able to do that. We actually get a third use of our barrel. When the barrel comes back from Mexico, we redump it with some of the smaller beer companies, and so they turn into an occasional imperial stout or a range of other things. So to see a barrel give its life 3 times for a noble cause is especially rewarding.
And it's cool to know and have products from all 3 of those uses. Because usually if we said dump out barrels of Buffalo Trace, stock barrels, some of those barrels might go to Sam Adams, some might go to Europe, some might go to Mexico, but you don't know what's coming out of that barrel again.
Yeah, to have that DNA connection just gives it a certain level of elite quality. Yeah, no, there's nothing quite like that. This is exciting. So with that, I'm also considering, assuming you've got people that pick barrels and regularly do that as your sampling, but I don't know to what extent you have a team available for blending, but having cognac or rum in your portfolio gives you the possibility of taking the bourbons that you already have and creating additional programs by finishing the barrels. That would take some blending skill, but you've got all these companies available. I've been lobbying Mark to do a Calvados company, is another one of my fantasies, as well as buying wine barrels. There's anything from Madeira to Banyuls, French Grenache, that would develop into some nice bright flavors. Has there been any thought to blending additional barrels with bourbon?
Yeah. There's a world of knowledge in your head that I wish was in my head. I wish I was an expert outside of bourbon and tequila, and I'm not even an expert in tequila yet. Barrel sales are my go-to, but we want to be selling barrels from all over the world. And with our experimental program, as we've added other distilleries, you can see these things that were just experiments at Buffalo Trace now go outward, and then it lets us do more interesting things. So I think as we start adding more distilleries, we add cognac, we're gonna add rum, then anything that's kind of blending or anything special projects like that, we would be interested in. As far as finishing bourbon, I don't think you'll see us doing much bourbon finishes because we've done a lot with the experimental program.
You have?
And there was a bunch to release in early 2000s with a lot of
Why
finishes.
would you do an experimentals if you didn't have a sort of a curiosity about building that into a
Anyway, we
product?
had the curiosity and then we satisfied it, and I just don't think
Yeah.
That's a tease.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
But you said earlier, never is a very long time, and who knows what could happen.
Maybe just not like a Buffalo Trace focus, but at one of those other distilleries, maybe they'll take on more of that focus there.
The Bowman A. Smith program has always been doing that too. There's an Isaac program with just ports alone.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of some incredibly cool things that have come out of the Smith programs with gingerbread and vanilla and some really cutting edge ideas that are well made. They're not just like kind of cool concepts, but they're actually developed to very rewarding fruition. What do we think the future of American whiskey is?
It's looking bright. I mean, based on kind of the expansion that we're doing at the distillery, we're banking on it being good for at least the next few years. But I think just even with bourbon as a whole here, it's obviously becoming very popular. Other countries, it's still learning about it and everything like that. So, I mean, there's definitely room to grow, and I think that it will grow pretty big. We're hoping for it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of Great Britain colonized the world, took Scotch with them. So Scotch all over the world. 100 million cases plus. I think bourbon's around like 20 million, somewhere there as a whole. So there has been this giant bourbon boom, but it hasn't really been from the amount of bourbon being bottled. It's more, we're producing more, but the bottling part hasn't really hit yet. It's the demand is what surged all of a sudden. We would have thought at this point we'd been able to sell in other countries already, but America has this insatiable thirst for bourbon that we didn't expect. So we want and need a footprint in other countries just because, like you said, it is going to do this little, pendulum. And if it does do a pendulum, we don't want to have all our eggs in one basket. Now, if you just think of the history of bourbon, business was booming, Prohibition knocked on its butt. Great Depression, same time, didn't help. So then you got World War II. And during World War II, they used the Kentucky distilleries. They would take the barrels used for industrial alcohol, rubbing alcohol, whatever. A byproduct of fermentation was penicillin. So they basically shut down during the war efforts. World War II ends, and then there's troops are home, insatiable thirst for whiskey. So we're making a ton, but can't bottle it fast enough. So then the Korean War fires off in the early 1950s, and everyone thinks World War III is coming. So all the distilleries overproduce. They fill all these warehouses with barrels that aren't really forecasted, but they assume they're going to lose some to the war. So World War III never happened. All those barrels start aging up, going down in volume. So all the distillers are losing money, start cutting costs any way they can, and by the late 70s, it just all fell apart. So if you really think about the history of bourbon, it hasn't really had a good chance to grow globally yet. And then you start early 80s, Maker's Mark dips the head in wax, made a really pretty package, kind of got, made consumers think about bourbon as a nice product again. Elmer T. Lee came out with Blanton's, bottling it as a single barrel bourbon. And so there's been this slow crawl up, and all of a sudden in the last, I'd say like 10 years, it's just boom. So we are very confident that as long as we play our cards right and don't have any, prohibition or another world war that is going to suck up all our inventory, that we're doing it right.
You make the best possible whiskey that's within your powers, and with continual experimentation and integrity, the demand will continue to grow. it will change. That's part of why I was lobbying for ranges in rum and things, because people go into what if. As much as they like bourbon, they're curious about other spirits, and that's an extension that you're already doing. And I think the whole process is exciting because spirits have taken on a new life, and to some extent it's usurped some beer, it's usurped some wine. But my background was in wine, and I love working with spirits. The depth and the richness that spirits offer continue to scintillate and humble me. It is how much more there is to learn. I love this process.
Yeah, listening to Rebecca from Last Drop yesterday talk about the port wine from the 1870s, it was the humbling thing. It's as soon as I think I know a lot about what I'm doing, then I just realize I don't know anything. There's so much going on, so many things we could put in a barrel and age.
That was so good.
Yeah, it was delicious.
You know, you'd think that something that old would be kind of musty and funky, but it was bright, and there was just a lot of richness and dimension from grapes. You know, that's inspiring.
Well, I think so. Long term,
finish a bourbon in that.
Long term with our barrel program, we're going to be selling barrels from all around the world. Sazerac has a distillery. Like we haven't even talked about Indian whiskey. We'll have barrels of Indian whiskey in the program. But if we have a distillery that has barrel-aged spirits, we want to put it in our barrel program. But American whiskey is always going to be the bulk of it. I think that's what I would bet on.
Maybe we can get George Grant to allow us a Glenn Farclas program at some point
One
as well.
day. Been asking.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed today's experience, and I know I have. And we look forward to our next visit.